One. Welcome to IEEE Tech Talk on Future of Electric Transportation Targets, Plans, and Actions. My name is Baba Kanayati. I'm with National Grid, and I'll be moderating this panel session. Before we get started, I want to walk you through some of the housekeeping notes. If you do have any technical support, if you do need any technical support, there's a yellow box with a question mark on it. Click on that, and you can contact the right person that would provide that technical support. You do have any questions for the panelists, I strongly encourage that you do participate on the discussion and ask questions. So there's a Q&A tab on the screen. So click on that and submit your questions. Throughout the session, I will be screening the questions and ask some of the questions from the panelists, and we'll try to answer as many questions as we can, given we only have 1 hour for this talk. And for those of you who do need some certification that you participated in this session, there's this icon you see in that yellow box. You click on that, that's a certificate icon, and the system will basically, you'll automatically receive that certificate for your use later on. And just to let you know, today's session is being recorded, and within 22 hours after we finish the session, you will receive a link through On Demand, the PES On Demand and IEEE On Demand, that you can listen and share with your contacts as well. This is a joint effort between IEEE Educational Activities and IEEE Power and Energy Society. I am serving as the Vice President of Education for IEEE Power and Energy Society, and I'm happy that we had this opportunity to work with IEEE Educational Activities to put together this session. This is the second session of the Tech Talk series that we have started in the past, I would say, 6 months. The first session, the focus was on climate change and actions and policies and standard developments and all the other issues that were discussed at that session. And today's session is basically focused on more like detail-oriented towards electric transportation. Today, we have 3 very distinguished and renowned speakers, and I'm so honored to serve as the moderator of the session. We have Andrew Vishnia, Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy and U.S. Department of Transportation, Steve Warner, President of National Grid New England, and Rick Fioravanti, Executive Advisor and Director of Transportation Electrification with Quanta Technology. The way we're gonna, the theme of the session, the flow of the session is such that I'll have each panelist give us approximately around like 7 minutes of introductory remarks, and then we'll go to the Q&A session, and in the end, each panelist will have 2 minutes for the closing remarks as well. So with that intro, we'll start with Andrew.
Well, hello, I'm so glad for the opportunity to speak with IEEE today. Thanks so much for having me. I'm Andrew Wishnia, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Climate Policy at the U.S. Department of Transportation. As the Department of Transportation, dives in on building a safer, more equitable, more modern, climate-friendly transportation system, I just couldn't be more thrilled to be with this group. So thanks again for having me. DOT's climate work, for those that are unfamiliar with it, stretches across the transportation modes. So jumpstarting bicycle and pedestrian projects, ensuring that communities have access to reliable public transit, challenging the aviation industry to drive down their emissions, and so much more. But today I want to focus specifically on our electrification work, as this has been quite an exciting time at DOT as we work to help electrify cars, buses, and other forms of transportation. Electrifying transportation has many exciting benefits, from cleaner air to protecting Americans from gas price fluctuations. And thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law, the department now has a suite of new resources and opportunities to expand electrification across the transportation system. We've been given a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to lead the electric vehicle revolution, and that includes a few key programs. One, we have the Port Infrastructure Development Program under the purview of the Maritime Administration. PIDP has expanded eligibilities to allow for funding for electric vehicle charging or hydrogen refueling infrastructure, from drayage and medium or heavy duty trucks and locomotives that service the port and related grid upgrades. We also have the CMAQ program, the Congestion Mitigation and Air Quality Improvement Program, that was expanded to allow for the funding of the purchase of medium or heavy duty zero emission vehicle and related charging equipment. Under the bipartisan infrastructure law, we also have the Surface Transportation Block Grant Program that now has expanded eligibility for electric vehicle charging infrastructure and vehicle-to-grid infrastructure. We have the Bus and Bus Facilities Grant Program that can deploy zero-emission buses. We have the Low and No Emission Bus Program under the purview of the Federal Transit Administration as well, which can help deploy clean buses. And we have the Electric or Low Emitting Ferry Pilot Program that can provide grants for the purchase of electric or low emitting ferries and the electrification of other reduction of emissions from existing ferries. In fact, President Biden's historic bipartisan infrastructure law marks the largest investment in EV infrastructure in American history. To focus in on one program in particular that I didn't mention, we have the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, or the NEVI program, which provides $5 billion for states to begin to build out a nationwide EV charging network. And that's what I want to focus on today. For this program, we've issued guidance on how states can and should use their allotted money. The guidance focuses on providing information for states, on the strategic deployment of EV chargers on interstate and designated highway corridors, while also establishing key technical guidance and explicitly addressing administration priorities such as Justice 40 and workforce development. And in the coming weeks, we'll also be issuing minimum standards and requirements for EV chargers funded by our new programs. In addition to the $5 billion formula program, we will also be implementing a $2.5 billion discretionary grant program to strategically deploy publicly accessible EV charging infrastructure in hydrogen, propane, and natural gas fueling infrastructure. That program has two different components. One's a corridor program, and one is a community charging grant program for charging and fueling infrastructure in communities. The federal funding will directly jumpstart a national EV charging network and also catalyze additional private investment to help provide a convenient, reliable, affordable, and above all, equitable national EV charging network. And to implement all of this funding, we're collaborating closely with our colleagues at the Department of Energy on the exciting new Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, which will coordinate all of our efforts on EV charging and provide information and resources on EV charging to stakeholders and the public. We know that EVs are the cars of the future. That much we know. The auto industry, with demonstrated support from their consumers, have already made huge strides in moving in this direction. But we do need to ensure three things, right? One, that the shift will happen quickly enough to make a meaningful difference in the fight against the climate crisis. Two, that EVs and EV chargers are made in America, by American workers. And three, that they'll be affordable and accessible enough for every American driver to reap the benefits. So I think you all know that this work is going to take all of us. In conclusion, DOT's goal in supporting the deployment of EV charging is to make EV charging infrastructure part of the surface transportation system. The charging system that we help to build out must integrate into a larger, clean, safe, equitable, and affordable transportation network. And as we move forward, it's going to be critical for us to partner with stakeholders like yourselves. So I'm really, grateful for the opportunity to be with you all today to also answer some questions. And we're really looking forward to collaborating with you as we work to electrify our nation's vehicles. Thanks so much for having me.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. I'm glad you mentioned that, the collaboration between DOT and other departments is also very important to actually implement that $5 billion funding. Especially you mentioned DOE, and I want to also highlight that, the national labs are also a critical part of this, to make sure that the research is being done properly, the testing, and all the and anything that needs to be done in the lab prior to larger scale deployment is very important. Thanks for your remarks. Before we get into other other parts of this panel session, and that $5 billion, just out of curiosity, are there any sort of like preferred investment in rural versus cities? Has the department kind of looked into that to make sure that we're I heard this idea of compact cities and things like that. Is it in that plan as well?
So let me speak, broadly to DOT's role in enabling electric transportation in rural areas. All Americans, I think we can agree, regardless of where they live, should have the opportunity to benefit, from the lower operating costs, the reduced maintenance needs, and improved performance that EVs provide. Rural parts of the country are home to, I'd say, about 20% of Americans and almost 70% of America's road miles. But the rate of EV adoption, to your question, in rural areas is roughly 40% lower than it is in urban areas. Rural residents drive more than their urban counterparts. They spend more on vehicle fuel and maintenance. They often have fewer alternatives to driving in order to meet their transportation needs. So we've got to do something about that. And over the long run, EVs will help residents of rural areas reduce costs, minimize environmental impact of transportation in their communities. So that's why we are working to ensure that rural areas aren't left behind in the transition to EVs. We did come up with a rural EV toolkit called Charging Forward, a toolkit for planning and funding rural electric mobility infrastructure. So this is a free, comprehensive resource to help rural stakeholders, scope, plan, and fund EV charging infrastructure in any rural entity, such as an individual property owner or a business, a town, a tribe, a planning agency. Any rural entity can use the toolkit to identify key partners to engage on a project, to take advantage of the planning tools most relevant to the project envisioned, and to identify available funding or financing to help make the project a reality. It's also worth noting that rural areas can take advantage of some of the other opportunities that I highlighted earlier, the Bus and Bus Facilities Grant Program, the Low and No Emission Bus Program, the Electric or Low Emitting Ferry Pilot Program. And lastly, as it relates to the $5 billion in particular, we are making sure that equity undergirds all of the investments for electrification. That includes overburden, that includes underserved communities, and that includes our rural communities as well. We want to ensure at the end of the day a national strategic network of 500,000 chargers that connects all of America. And by all of America, we mean all of America.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it. All right. So our next speaker, excuse me, is Steve Warner. Steve is the president of National Grid in New England. So Steve, the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me today. I look forward to the discussion, and we'll get into, I'm sure, some Q&A, so I'll be brief. National Grid, for those of you who are not familiar, we're a large energy company with operations in both the UK and the US. For purposes of this discussion, I'm going to focus mainly on our T&D operations in the US, which are in New York, Massachusetts, and Rhode Island. We're committed to being the energy transition company that's out there working with all stakeholders, our customers, the regulators, elected officials, in those regions that we serve to help meet and address the climate needs, the climate goals that have been set for those regions. We're making investments in our electric grid to enable EV charging, and we're installing public EV charging stations. I'll just touch on 5 other things I thought might be relevant to this conversation. We continue to participate in the growing and expanded National Electric Highway Coalition, and we now serve on the Coalition Steering Committee. So each utility within the coalition is taking steps to provide charging solutions in their service territories and collaborating across jurisdictions to ensure accessibility, reliability, and coordination for a positive customer experience. This endeavor is connecting a cohesive network of fast chargers along major highways and expanding across the country to include utilities everywhere. We have an employee EV charging program where we're encouraging employees to learn and adopt this technology. Since we launched that program in April of 2018, hundreds of employees have taken advantage of the financial incentives, and we have now installed charging stations in all of our larger reporting locations to allow workplace charging with a level 2 charger. Our group CEO serves on the Edison Electric Institute CEO Transportation Task Force, Electric Transportation Task Force, and that task force goal is to accelerate the growth of the market by focusing on how member companies develop electric transportation programs, advance federal policy, promote industry coordination. A new collaborative working group has been formed in partnership with the co-chair companies and a few leading members. And the group is engaging industry partners, sharing best practices, coordinating to prepare our company and others to this future. We're also a member of the Corporate Electric Vehicle Alliance that is a collaborative group of companies focused on accelerating the transition to electric vehicles. It supports companies in making and achieving bold commitments to fleet electrification, and loosely aggregates the corporate demand for EVs to expand the business case for production of a more diverse array of EV models for fleets. So as a member of the Alliance, we work with other member companies to share best practices and serve as industry leaders within the transportation electrification transformation. And finally, I'd say we've been an active member of the Alliance for Transportation Electrification, with a key member of our team serving on its board of directors and a number of staff leading and engaging in various committees. The Alliance advocates for the acceleration of transportation electrification nationwide, and believes that a multi-stakeholder coalition educating and promoting the benefits of transportation electrification is necessary and will benefit the public welfare of the United States for many reasons. With that, I'll turn it back to you, Vivek.
Thank you, Steve. Appreciate it. These are all great initiatives that the National Grid is working on, and those initiatives that you mentioned that the company is a member of is extremely important, because this is not just one utility issue or one energy sector. So that collaboration is extremely important to make sure on the utility side, where all the policies and standards and all that needs to be implemented, we are aware of what's happening in our region and what steps we need to take to make sure that we meet our targets. So yeah, thank you for your remarks, and we'll definitely touch some of your talking points in the Q&A. So our next speaker is Rick Fioravanti with Quanta Technology. So Rick, back to you.
Thanks, Vivek, and again, thank you, like all of us, with the opportunity to speak today. I wanted to dive a little bit more into some of the details of nuances we're seeing in the field today. But first, Quanta Technology, we're about a 300-person consulting company focusing on utility and engineering support. But we're part of a larger $15 billion EPC company that focuses on utility infrastructure, telecom, and renewable deployment, our parent being Quanta Services. But diving into this a little bit, I wanted to note that one of the questions that came up is some of the differences that we're seeing in Europe compared to the U.S. Particularly, we initially had this perception Europe was already using smaller, more efficient vehicles. Would there be a faster adoption in Europe as compared to the US? But we are seeing that, actually. Europe is seeing significant uptakes over the last year. And so what are the reasons for that? More chargers, regulations, incentives, more vehicles. I think one of the main changes that we have seen is the focus on CO2 emission standards in Europe. Those were tightened recently, going down to 95 grams per kilometer from previously at 130. And so you're seeing an uptick that is kind of related to that change. Also, we're seeing a lot more models being introduced into the market, both here in the U.S. and in Europe. But we're some of the geographics. We're seeing in Europe concentration in metropolitan areas compared to some of the rural areas. So we are seeing uptakes in Europe, but it's not uniform across the entire area, much like some of the challenges we are seeing here. You are seeing increases in charging infrastructure, but one of the notes is that no real consistent pattern there. Obviously, more vehicles, more chargers is something that we do consistently see, but we don't really come up with, a perfect ratio of chargers to vehicles or what is that ratio in cities versus other areas that encourages it. So probably some of the reason that we're seeing the uptick in Europe is more of a regulatory issue that we're seeing, and plus just the fact that greater concentrations in cities where we're seeing some of the uptakes and zero emission initiatives that we're seeing as well. There's this question that we always have in this industry when you're introducing new technologies: markets before mandates. What do you do, right? Do you let the markets drive it? Do you create mandates or regulations that help encourage it? In Europe, we tend to see more of a reliance on regulations, but doesn't mean that is the only or the best way. Some of the other things that we're seeing in Europe, which I've investigated previously, is some of the ZEV initiatives that we're having, creating zero emission zones in cities. So this is where you get concentrated downtown areas where you see mandates about emissions for vehicles that operate in those areas. Something Europe is doing a little bit faster than we are. So for example, Uber or rideshare vehicles that operate within a certain section of the city would have zero emission mandates put on them, driving them to adopt vehicles for those areas. This is becoming much, much more easier to do today with technology that we have, scanning equipment, monitoring equipment that we can have, vehicles going into certain designated areas that also help make some of those initiatives possible. But again, we also see just shorter distances, less reliance on trucks and SUVs, maybe some of the reasons that Europe is going a little faster. No real hard set reason for it other than maybe a combination of a lot of factors. It is an interesting trend when we start looking at the US. It's a unique aspect of what we've seen in the auto industry is this inversion where vehicle manufacturers would make profits off of passenger vehicles. That has actually been inverted recently, where trucks and SUVs are really the biggest area of profits for vehicles. And so a lot of the issues that we could expect to see in the US may be a lag in the fact that a lot of the early electric vehicles were smaller vehicles. As we start getting into trucks and SUVs electrifying, you're probably going to see a greater uptick of electrification of passenger vehicles in the US. In fact, a year and a half ago, I wrote a blog. If you want to see how electrification is going to go in the US, follow the Ford F-150. One of the leading vehicles being sold in the US, as that is now being rolled out with an electric version, how that gets adopted in the US will tell you what we expect to see, because we do have a society here that loves our trucks and our SUVs. Some of the challenges that this does create, charging patterns, how do we predict that? This is one of the things that quantum technology focuses on, is understanding the impacts of charging on our electricity grid. This is one of the unique parts about it. We expect to see charging to happen at homes, but as this market changes, past predictions of charging habits are not good indicators of what we expect to see in the future. And what I mean by that is the vehicle batteries are getting larger, the ranges are getting larger, and the ability to charge outside of the home, in some cases with faster chargers, are becoming more ubiquitous. And as that starts happening, it does create a challenge on what do we expect to see. Do we expect to see people charging or topping off their vehicles every night? Or do we expect them to see them leveraging the charging opportunities in public spaces, or using what could be even a gas station approach and charging once every 2 weeks? When we start getting 300, 400 mile range vehicles, you can expect some of the charging habits to change as we start going forward. Also, the fast chargers being more expensive, we also see a greater propensity of public level 2 chargers instead of faster chargers. Also something that we're seeing in Europe, some of the cities and countries that have the fastest or the largest amount of chargers being deployed have some of the lower percentages of fast chargers within that. But I do want to talk about emissions, because that was talked about a couple times in the last 2 minutes here, that when we look at the transportation sector, it has overcome the power industry as being the leading emission factor in the US for CO2 contributions. And so that is something that, why we see such a focus on passenger vehicles. They do make up a majority of the emissions that we see in this area, 57% to 24% for heavy-duty vehicles. But it's the medium heavy-duty trucks that at Quanta Technology we're focusing on. 5% of the vehicles on the road are heavy-duty, but those account for 24% of the emissions. And I do, when we talk about emissions and equity, I want to note that it's not just CO2, but some of the harmful effects of heavy-duty vehicle diesel emissions, SOx, NOx, PM, that contribute to both people's health and smog, are not CO2 related, but they're these other factors, these other emissions that also happen. And sometimes those emissions can get dwarfed by the focus on climate and the focus on CO2. But a lot of times where we see where these heavy duty trucks are traveling tend to be in areas that are low income. And so the equity piece comes into full force when you start looking at improvements that could be made to those areas. As I said, it's not just CO2, it's other emissions as well. We're focusing on the freight supply chains, because when we start looking at ports, airports, surrounding areas, that's where we're seeing a dramatic increase of loads. So for example, a seaport, both the electrification happens at the port, the trucks that are going into that port, which are housed outside of the port, and then the distribution centers and truck logistics centers around that that are also electrifying. When you start adding those numbers up, it can get very significant. In fact, when we looked at combining that with some of the shore power initiatives happening at ports, we were seeing loads of 60 to 120 megawatts. And that's 120 megawatts of load being adopted in certain areas to electrify. And so even though there's a lot of effort, because there's many, many more passenger vehicles than there are heavy duty, from an engineering perspective and a challenge perspective, heavy duty is just a very exciting area with creating a lot of challenges just because of the size of the vehicles, size of the batteries, and the impact that concentration movement of freight puts on our emissions and on our grid. So thank you for that, and I look forward to answering any questions folks may have.
Excellent. Thank you, Rick. So you've been more like interacted with technology developers and manufacturers, the EV manufacturers. One of the concerns that I have, we keep talking about, we're going to replace the cars, all 100% EVs on the road by a certain year. This is like, we call it zero emission, and it's definitely helping from a greenhouse gas emission perspective. However, the research that I've done on the manufacturing side, the amount of greenhouse gas emission for an EV manufacturer is higher than a typical car that works based on gas. Are you aware of any sort of research that basically looks into this to maybe consider different types of batteries, more efficient, different chemistry, that actually on the manufacturing side, we also see less greenhouse gas emission, compared to other types of vehicles that we have, on the manufacturing pace?
Was that a question directed to me?
Yes. Yeah.
I think a lot of these studies, it's kind of hard to put a finger on that. When we start looking at the emissions, it's really just from the operation of the vehicles, not from the manufacturing of what we look at. So from an operation perspective, the emissions that we are creating from operating of, for example, trucking diesel engines is significantly higher than what we expect what we see on the electrification side. And as I said, that's not just CO2. That's for some very harmful emissions, SOx, NOx, and particulate matter, that do have measurable impacts on health, and folks in particular areas as well. And so I think from that perspective, when you start looking at the benefits of it, it's hard to not be impressed by some of the potential benefits you get out of transportation vehicles.
Okay. Thank you, Rick. All right. I think we are good to start our more like discussion part of the session. So Andrew, we do have many policymakers on this call now, and not just the U.S. but other regions as well. I know you talked about more like the funding opportunities and the support that federal government is providing. I have two questions for you. Number one, what is the process for? Do you basically provide this funding to states, and each state will work with local utilities and technology developers to come up with the right plans? Are they the decision makers, or is there like can you speak to how collaboratively utilities can be engaged in this program? I would appreciate that. And the other thing is, as I mentioned, we have many policymakers on this call. What are your recommendations globally that other government, other countries can come up with kind of like similar programs? And as you know, not all countries, of course, have the same resources as U.S. does.
Well, thank you so much for those questions. The first question is, it depends. So the $5 billion in funding is a portion to state departments of transportation, meaning those funds are going by formula just to state DOTs. And then state DOTs, through guidance that FHWA issued within 90 days of the date of enactment of the bipartisan infrastructure law, in consultation with a number of different stakeholders, are supposed to develop state EV infrastructure action plans. And those action plans, deployment plans, are due August 1st of this year, so just in several months' time. And then FHWA, in coordination with the Joint Office of Energy and Transportation, will approve those plans or ask for additional modifications by September 30th. So that is the way that program works. Again, as I mentioned in my remarks, we have a separate $2.5 billion bucket for discretionary grants. And those discretionary grants have different rules of the road. Those are open to more entities, including metropolitan planning organizations, including territories, including tribes, including local officials. That process will begin in earnest, later this year, and we're hoping to have a NOFO available in the November timeframe. And in both of those processes, I think utilities as well as other stakeholders that are part of the EV ecosystem, should have their voice heard and should be a part of those processes. So the reason I'm telling you about the EV infrastructure, state plans and the NOFO that's, potentially forthcoming is now is the opportunity, now is the time, to get a seat at the table to make sure that you're informing and helping to support your state's EV deployment plan, because it's going to take all of us. It's going to take, the private sector. It's going to take the public sector. We're looking to supplement, not supplant, investments that are borne out and made by the private sector. And the way to do that is for all of us to engage in a Big Tent process. In terms of, advice for our international counterparts, in some ways, there's a lot of countries that are leading by example, particularly the Scandinavian countries, a large cohort of which their fleet has already been electrified or is on the way to be electrified. Norway comes to mind being one. I'd say more broadly, it just takes the will to do so. The investment that we made in the bipartisan infrastructure law in November is transformative in scope, not just for EV charging infrastructure, but in terms of sort of the top level funding numbers and in terms of the opportunity to, transform our transportation system. So now is the tough part, the hard part, but also the fun part, to work to conceive of 21st century transportation infrastructure that is convenient, that's reliable, that's accessible, and that is equitable. And that's what we're endeavoring to accomplish with a whole of government strategy and through a diversity of perspective, including folks who are on the call today.
Excellent. Thank you, Andrew. Steve, so far we have touched on more like the easy parts of the electric transportation, all the great benefits and goals and stuff, and of course the federal funding that really helps states to actually implement their programs. I want to switch because, you're leading a large utility, and that really utilities are actually the one that is going to implement all of this. Connect all these charging stations to their network, and hopefully in the future also enable vehicle to grid, discharging as well, because it does have some benefits that we're going to cover later. So I want to switch a little bit on the challenges, and I want to hear from you on so what do you see as the major hurdles and challenges in the next decade that need to be resolved from both policy perspective and hopefully can touch on some of the technical issues as well, and so that we accomplish our goals based on the plan that we have.
Oh, let me just start by saying, it's been said transportation is the largest source of greenhouse emissions. It is in my region of the country that I serve as well. In the Northeast, that's 40% of carbon emissions. And electrification of transportation then is fundamental. It has to be accomplished and accomplished well to meet our state's goals and meet the needs of our customers and our community. So as was touched on earlier, this is would benefit public health, air quality, environmental outcomes, and supporting complementary policy and regulatory initiatives at the federal, state, and regional level will be necessary in order to accomplish this. So as a company, we have a 2030 decarbonization strategy, our net zero by 2050 business goals, and we're fully supportive of these targets. And we are highly engaged to accelerate the transformation in this transportation sector. Getting more to your question, smart integration of electric transportation will help us optimize the grid, provide opportunities for customers to participate and have savings and enable a clean energy future. So, we've got to build the infrastructure, of course, that interconnects these EV charging stations. And we want to make sure that's done in an equitable way by incentivizing charging infrastructure and electric transport access to underserved and overburdened communities. Right. So I guess touching on some of some of the specific challenges that you brought up in your question or opportunities, customers imagine a future where the vehicle can actually generate back to the grid. Right. And I'll just share an example. We did last fall in Beverly, Massachusetts. We took electric school buses, and for the first time, leveraged that as a demand response program in New England. Right. So one of the first instances that I'm aware of that an electric school bus supported the electric grid during the summer. Right. So the buses are highly used during all time periods except for the summer where they're less utilized, and yet they had this battery in there. So the one bus delivered 3 megawatt hours of power back to the electricity grid, lowering demand and helping the grid at time of peak need, right? So just an example. Imagine as we electrify transportation across the board, if people have that opportunity where they're not going to be driving that vehicle that day and it happens to be a peak demand day, we want to enable our infrastructure to be able to accept that supply back into the grid. Keep in mind, most vehicles are charged overnight, during a low cost period and a low demand period. And if they can be utilized during the day to supplement the grid when they're not being used for transportation, that's a key feature we want to make sure is enabled. Another thing, in order to accomplish these goals, it requires a substantial adoption, which, there are lots of new models coming out, right, which will make that happen. But one of the things you hear from potential consumers is not everybody has a driveway or a garage where they can charge their vehicle. So they're looking for fast charging networks to be deployed, and we spoke on those earlier. But some areas, the parking space they have is in front of their home, but there's no garage, there's no driveway. So one thing we did in the Melrose area of Massachusetts is we installed utility pole-mounted EV chargers. And these are devices that actually, when activated, lower a cable that allows charging to occur right there at the curb, right? It was an innovation that we're started to deploy, and it's been well received by customers. So just an example of a couple things. I could probably go on forever, but I think I addressed the kernel of your question, Vivek.
Yes, thank you, Steve. Appreciate that. I want to continue this discussion on V2G because I think that's the next phase in terms of, once we do have that chargers installed, we are seeing some pilot programs, as Steve mentioned, some of them in Mass, and I'm aware of say like in other utilities like Dominion, where they use, they've started this pilot with the school buses, their hours of operations are predictable. So at the time that, the buses are not needed, they're ready to actually discharge to the grid and help with like peak shaving as well, which again defers the capital investment, and again helps with the customer electric bills. And when we're predicting, the load growth in some areas that may require some distribution and transmission system upgrades. So Rick, same question for you in terms of, V2G. I've seen some, like, as I said, like more like pilot scale, projects. In your opinion, first of all, have you seen like larger scale deployment of this V2G program? And if that's the case, the utilities that are enabling this solution, what are the challenges that they've faced? And if you have any insight on, how those issues are being addressed, I think that would be really appreciate if you could say a few words on that as well.
Well, I think there's a lot of pilots going on. The benefits of tapping into vehicle batteries are not disputed. They're obvious, right? Ability to tap into those batteries during peak times is an exciting thing. From the perspective of a car owner, maybe not as exciting to support the grid. I think it's going to be very interesting to look. And again, I hate to focus on one particular manufacturer, but when you look at the Ford F-150, what they've done in that case is they've made that battery part of the working of the truck, where you go to a site, you plug your power tools into it. You, if your house loses power, you plug it in and power your house. So it's the focus of that vehicle getting integrated more into your everyday life and getting additional features. Like when you have a car today and you're able to charge your cell phone in your car, they've kind of taken that and elevated it to much more expanded opportunity of usage. And it'll be interesting to see how that impacts consumers. When you look at other sectors, the school bus was mentioned. That's a profile that fits perfectly into V2G to support that. And so that's why you're seeing a lot of focus on that area. But, it's still, I think I can go back to there was a DoD initiative, Department of Defense initiative, to look at V2G activities with vehicles at the Defense Department. And it technically works. Does it benefit overcome some of the issues of having your battery be deployed to support the grid as opposed to support your own needs? So it's an interesting question. A lot of benefits of it, but more interesting to see how consumers interpret it and what they prefer to do with their vehicles.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rick. So, Andrew, I have another question for you, and I think some of the folks on the call also asking a similar question. It's great that federal government is providing this funding opportunity and financial support for the deployment of these charging stations and electrifying the transportation. However, the issue is broader than that, but meaning, when we're adding hundreds of millions of, charging stations on our network, and I'm not just limiting this question with the U.S., but feel free to only just share your thoughts from federal government perspective. So that adds a lot of complexity in terms of grid operations. Of course, when this demand increases, the electricity needs to come from clean sources as well. And of course, that has its own timeline. So we do have, plans to implement or deploy offshore wind, for the next decade. So we need to consider all of this in the equation. And the question is, how is the Department of Transportation coordinating the implementation of the charging stations with, the electricity generation and DOE and other departments where, they're kind of overseeing the other aspects of energy?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one that we were earnestly wanting to solve for as part of the enactment of the bipartisan infrastructure law. And so nestled in the $1.2 trillion packet is this joint office of energy and transport. The funding amount doesn't necessarily, inform the importance and significance of that new joint office. So it's, just $300 million just relative to some of the other amounts in the bipartisan infrastructure law, but $300 million are set aside from the $5 billion that are apportioned to state departments of transportation for building out charging infrastructure to set up this new joint office of energy and transportation. And it turns out that the career apparatus at DOT and DOE have been, working assiduously for a number of years, if not decades at this point, on the nexus of energy and transportation issues, including alternative fuels. But this really codifies that relationship and sends a market signal that DOT and DOE are closely and intimately aligned. I'm on phone calls literally every single day with Department of Energy leadership to make sure that we get this right, both on the technology side, which the Department of Energy has subject matter expertise on, and how to integrate that into the transportation system. So as it relates specifically with respect to transmission, we have a lot of transmission dollars in the bipartisan infrastructure law, I think, which goes to the nub of your question. We also have some opportunity to look at transmission within the joint office. And we are actively making sure that as we are building out our charging infrastructure, that is supported by the transmission that can do so. That transmission, to your point, needs to ultimately become cleaner and more renewable. And we're going to work, with states, with localities, with the public and private sector to get that done.
Excellent. I also want to highlight the importance of utilizing new technologies that enable this plan, like grid enhancing technologies that national labs have been leading in terms of testing and large scale deployment, and National Grid has also been actively participating in those programs and discussions. And Andrew, looking at this issue globally, of course, the U.S. government was part, when we had the Paris Agreement, U.S. government was present, and then we kind of said, okay, bye for a few years, and then we came back. What are your thoughts on, how, of course, like the issue of global warming is just like one or two countries, it's global. In your opinion, how is the process of electrifying transportation going globally? Are there, countries that are kind of leading this and sharing the best practices with others? And if the answer is yes, what actions are being taken to make sure that, the countries that do not have kind of like similar resources can also catch up and be on the same page or be able to deploy these programs in a timely manner?
Yeah, I think you asked, a version of this question earlier. There's a lot of international fora and opportunities for us to engage with our international counterparts, both on lessons learned and on places where we can lead by example. Norway is clearly one of those countries that is leading by example. Their per capita rate is, quite significant. So we're looking to, to emulate some of those practices and others from other countries, but also to set our own mark. At the end of the day, we were the beneficiary of great economic investment in this country in the 20th century with the build out of the interstate highway system. But with that build out came a lot of, both intended and unintended consequences that we want to make sure that we don't make the same mistakes. So we need to learn sort of both lessons learned from abroad, but also lessons from our own past to make sure that we're not reliving or relitigating those same kinds of issues. And that's something that we're focused on, which is why Justice 40 is such a critical part of all of our transportation investments, but particularly with respect to electrification. And in this discussion here, we're attempting to understand where the failures were, the failure points, and how we can correct for that moving forward. International understanding is going to be a part of that overall picture.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. All right, great discussion. We're almost at the top of the hour, and as I promised, I'm going to give about like 2 minutes for each panelist for their closing remarks. So, Andrew, we'll start with you.
Well, thanks again for this conversation. Look forward to being in touch with everyone. If folks haven't checked out the Joint Office's website, it's available at driveelectric.gov. They are really the the foremost thinkers in electrification within the federal government. This is the best and brightest collection of the Department of Transportation and Department of Energy, and in the weeks and months to come, would love to solicit folks who are interested in new careers to come into either the Department of Transportation, the Department of Energy, or through this new joint office. It's really a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and we need to do this quickly to address our climate crisis, but also do this right, recognizing all of the administration priorities that are aligned against this initiative. Want to also mention, and it might be peculiar to mention this to an electrification crowd, but electrification is just one of the ways that we can decarbonize our transportation system. We're looking ultimately to create options for the American public to reduce trips, to shift trips, to improve trips, and to negate emissions. Electrification is part of our strategy to improve trips, but we're also looking to reduce VMT where it makes sense to do so, create those opportunities for the American public by improving bicycle infrastructure, improving pedestrian infrastructure, shifting trips by improving our transit, improving our rail. We have the greatest rail investment in the bipartisan infrastructure law since the creation of Amtrak, the greatest transit investment ever in our nation's history. So really appreciate talking about this one particular piece of the pie that's necessary but not sufficient to accomplish our decarbonization strategies. And thanks to IEEE again for having me.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it. Steve?
So thank you for having all of us today. This is an interesting discussion. I certainly learned things just by listening to my fellow presenters here on the panel. I would say for those considering how you can help, we outlined a number of ways in our various remarks in terms of what needs to be done to enable this transition for transportation. One other thing we can all do, while we're focused today on electrification of transportation, if you're tuning in because you're interested in how we can make a difference for the environment, I would say first look at how you're using energy today. Each and every one of us has an opportunity to be more efficient and use less energy to accomplish tasks, right? So utilities have always tried to encourage this, but it takes customer engagement in that conversation. And so if you are an early adopter of an EV, when are you charging? Are you taking advantage of the various programs that many utilities across the nation and the world have to steer your charging to off-peak hours so it's less demand on the grid, which then holds bills down for everyone and also allows the least cost and most efficient generators to supply the load instead of some of the peaking units, which might actually have more environmental impact when they operate. Keeps this more as a base load issue. Anyway, thank you for the questions and thank you for the opportunity to speak to the group today.
Thank you, Steve, for being with us today. And Rick.
Again, likewise, thank you for the opportunity. As a consultant, I get to focus on challenges that this creates. And I guess the one area that I always like to speak about is heavy duty versus what we're seeing in passenger vehicles. Heavy duty drives fast charging, and fast charging in the range of 300, 350 kW compared to what you see at homes that may be charging at 7 kW. To put that in perspective, a fleet of heavy duty vehicles, 350 kW to 500 kW is like putting a Best Buy in a parking slot. It's like putting an office building in a 5 foot by 4 foot parking slot, but then you want to put 20 of them lined up together. And so you can see the challenges that creates on the grid, and why, as you start looking in the future and looking to the adoption, one of the areas that a lot of folks on this call will be focusing on in the future. Again, we can be a little myopic in our view of electrification because we look at it from a passenger perspective. But when you start looking at the challenges that this whole electrification will create, look to what's happening on the heavy duty side, look what's happening to what we call ecosystems around ports and airports. And you can see that there's a lot of work to be done to help make this future happen.
Excellent. Thank you, Rick. Again, I want to thank you all for being with us today, and have a great day. Take care.